Hi everyone, welcome back to the Chronically Questioning podcast. My name is Tiana and it is December 1st, and this podcast just kind of came out of nowhere. It was a spur of the moment, and it's with Jenn. She's another former member of Third Day Worship Center, and she's ready to tell her story. And let's hear her out. Be nice in the comments. Don't harass anyone online. The church leadership doesn't matter. Don't harass anyone. Be kind. Listen, and hopefully we can enact some more changes. So I'm here with Jenn O'Rourke, and you're going to talk about your experience, what's been going on, why you're talking. How'd you get involved? That's always how I start. How did you get involved?
All right, 99. I had high school friends that had attended. One of them is now my sister-in-law.
Did you like it?
Yeah, absolutely, I did. I loved it when I was introduced to, Frontline at the time in 99, and it was a big-time conference with John Bevere. I'll never forget it. The worship was incredible. At 15 years old, I had already been walking through a lot of trauma in my own personal life. I have overcome a lot of various forms of childhood trauma. And part of that time in my life was just very vulnerable with court proceedings and a trial as I was a witness in a case. And so, obviously at that time at 15 years old, it was very attractive. And I kind of just did my own thing after I was introduced after a few months. But I came back to it at 17 because I had always had that imprinted in my mind. But it was just a really good first impression of a church.
So you started going as an older teen?
Yeah, when I was 17.
Yeah. Did you get involved with ministry at that time?
Not right away. When I was introduced to it, I had attended here and there as I was able to. My family did not attend Frontline when I was first introduced, so it was really hard to get there, but I had connected with a mentor. And so when I started going back in 2001, I reconnected with this mentor who took me out weekly, and I started counseling with the church counselor also weekly. So that was my stepping stone into coming back. And then, of course, having my high school friends who were also actively involved in the youth group. So I started with that. And then very quickly, I started going to Sunday services. It became my life. I dove in. I fall very quickly in love with people. So ministry started happening. Music ministry was the first thing that I started getting involved in. And that was the following January, which was about 3 months in at that point. I was part of the youth worship team, just as a backup though. At that time, I hadn't been leading out. So that's how I started with that. A lot of the wounds, I guess, that I had to face, I had music there. I had always just been a person who is very connected with music. And so once I was drawn in and I made the connections that I made, I knew that I wanted to be part of the worship team there. And I started up with backup singing. There was so much promise and so much hope, and you always had so much to look forward to. There was always messages of your destiny and you're called and chosen, and you knew for somebody who had gone through what I had gone through, and many people like me have had their own childhood stories, it was something that you wanted to achieve, was to do what God wanted you to do, what you were brought onto this earth to fulfill, whatever purpose that was. You wanted to make sure that you would do your best at completing that. So that was my heart.
How did you fall under the impression that this is what God wanted you to do?
Along the way, I always had prophetic words of something to do with music in my life while I was in the church setting. When I moved to Kingston, though, because of a lot of the transition that I went through, I had suicidal ideations as early as the age of 8. I guess to jump ahead back to when I was 17, it was kind of a no-brainer when I connected with the music at the church. And in that way, I was also able to, in my perspective at that time, connect with God through that channel, through that vein. I just knew that that was something that I wanted to be part of. And of course, they give you prophetic words about your destiny and how God's going to call you, or that you're chosen. I was very much quickly told, that is my home. That is my covering. That is my house. That was not to belong. I was not part of any other house, but that was the
Yeah.
house that I was supposed to belong
Did
part
they
of.
know that you had kind of a broken relationship with your family?
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. They knew my whole court situation. In fact, there was one youth leader that I hardly knew because, as I said, my first initial introduction with the church wasn't wasn't much of one. I wasn't there long before I had, in their terms, backslidden and got a boyfriend and stopped going. I stopped attending. But there's this one woman who came during my trial, and she sat there and she supported me, and I'll never forget her. She doesn't attend Third Day now, but if anyone made me feel valuable in that time, it was that woman. She took the time out of her day without hardly knowing me, and she came and she sat through the trial to support me as I testified.
That's
So,
awesome.
yeah. So I had some good experiences leading up to Third Day.
When did it start to go downhill? Did you ever question up until that point?
Honestly, Tiana, I would be here all day if I
Yeah.
talked to you about the many concerns I had over the 15 years. Okay, so there are things that started as early as within my very first year of being there. However, I had never entertained the thought of actually leaving the church because they were my new family.
Yep.
They, kind of, when you're first new, they serenade you with these prophetic words and friendships and promises of a destiny and purpose. And then all of a sudden, because I started branching out more and more within the youth leadership and the worship team through that mentorship that I had with that one particular mentor, I found that the message of subordination was huge. And that is something that I want to say. I don't want to get into all the nitty gritty experiences that I've had at Third Day because I don't think it's necessary to, at this point anyway, to highlight all of that. I think enough people have come forward with their own experiences to shine light that harm and exploitation have been done to many people.
Yep.
I'm not exempt from that equation. But I will say that within this church, there's a hierarchical approach. It's a structure of authoritarian leadership, and subordination is something that is demanded of you the more that you are supposedly walking closer to God and especially serving within a leadership role. So for me, coming out of, at 17, I was graduating high school, and instead of going to post-secondary school, based off of what had been prophesied over my life, that I was going to be part of full-time ministry, I chose to go to Bible college, and I did their 3-year program. I achieved a diploma in theology and then a third-year diploma in missions, and I've had fabulous experiences traveling the world. But in all that, there was a whole lot of things behind the scenes that really broke my spirit in a sense. And I know, news articles, you can't use the term mind fuck, but there were so many
Yeah.
times where it just felt like
Yeah.
there's no other way to explain it. Like,
Yeah.
and there would be reprimands for things where I didn't necessarily understand at the time, but the approach that was done that was used made me feel like I couldn't do any right, you know?
Yep.
And I think when you're struggling with building your identity, that's something even coming out of the church where I felt like, people outside of the church would view me as somebody who was a goody goody, but yet the church themselves saw me as too sinful to belong in the church in the end. Like I just couldn't do any right. And of course, when you're dealing with a 17-year-old girl, 18-year-old girl, 19-year-old girl who has a history and a background of trauma, there are things I've definitely done wrong. Don't hear what I'm not saying. I
Yeah. Yeah.
absolutely have made some wrong choices along the
Yeah.
way, and I had to grow and I had to mature, um, and human beings will hurt people. We'll all hurt each other. And that's why I always valued not leaving the church out of offense. And I always tried my best to reflect and see what I could have done differently. And it came to a point where one time, I'll share this, I was being rebuked for a spirit of pride, one of the many times that I was being rebuked for this. And I remember just crying. I gripped my chest after in my room and I went back to the person and I realized I was like, you know what, I need some clarification here. I need to tell them how I feel and explain that I'm completely confused at what they mean by that. And I specifically asked, what kind of behavior am I demonstrating that is being perceived as a spirit of pride? What is it that I need to change exactly? And I was told, when I say mind fuck, this is what I'm talking about. Excuse the French to any viewers or listeners here, but there's really no other way to describe it. But it was honestly like, when I asked for them to tell me, they told me that that is not something that they could tell me, that I needed to fast and pray and have God show me. Otherwise, I would change the behavior myself and it would not be a true, authentic change, but that God would have to show me. And then that way they would know that the change was authentic and real. And I just remember walking away from that being like, I'm never going to get this right.
God.
Okay. Yeah, social anxiety was really, it definitely came on me well into my mid-20s at that point. And, of course, you're dealing with other things attributed to that kind of modern day church, if you will call it that. Purity culture is a big one. There's a lot of competitiveness in the church just within that alone. People are striving to reach their destinies and they're waiting for the person that God has for them. And God forbid if two people like the same person at once, then everybody's trying their best to abstain from any relationship, not just sex, but any relationship until they
healthy.
Go ahead. It's competitive. There was a lot of competition there, whether people realized it at the time or not, but definitely there were some toxic components to the environment in that way too, that just didn't make the peer support something that was very obvious there. Eventually, from Bible college, I went into the Esther House.
Can you explain the Esther House?
For me, the Esther House was a destiny house, if I could put it that way. It was somewhere that would equip me with the skills that I needed to do. That was part of the call that God wanted me to have in my life. So whether it be like cooking and cleaning, I was totally going to assume that role. And even just the whole idea that this is to be misogynistic a little bit, right? Like that women need to learn how to cook. Like
that's how I took it. Anyone who explains it to me, I'm like, this sounds to me very misogynistic, but you didn't feel that way really.
No, at the time it was very much a life skill. That's how it was. And it's like, well, you know what? It is a life skill. So I can see their rationale behind that. And, they very much majored on the basics, but it was also an intensely, it was a program that was tailored to definitely not let you be human, if I could put it that way. Because if you were human, then there would be a reprimand about it, right? Like I don't ever recall, and maybe it was how I took it, or perhaps that's just the self-doubt operating there in my brain, because I still deal with that from time to time, especially when on the topic of third day. But I was applying the cooking and the cleaning, and that was something that was, grocery shopping. I had already lived on my own at this point. Like I started going into Bible school when I was 17, and I pretty much moved out of my home right away because it was a toxic environment. So I had lived on my own for quite a long time before going into the Esther House. So cooking and cleaning was not, it was something that I applied to be part of the program, but it wasn't something that was new for me, if I can put it that way. I definitely appreciated the new recipes that we got our hands on from some of the cooks that came and cooked with us. But I think what I gleaned from the most in the house was conflict management, because I had an abusive environment growing up and didn't know how to deal with conflict properly. And then, of course, when it came to worship ministry, at this point, I had been leading worship for a while. I was one of the worship leaders at the church. And so I found that as I was part of the Esther House program, I had more of a direct one-on-one mentorship with Francis and Edith themselves versus any other in-between mentors. So the reprimand or the rebukes for pride, all that ceased. I was nothing but encouraged to step out, sing out, to branch out and be the worship leader that I was supposed to be, and to facilitate an environment where heaven could invade the earth and miracles can happen and X, Y, and Z, and so I did have anxiety about it all. And I remember before every service, I would ask them, like, is there anything, can you direct this? Like, do you have any songs? Like, I would always submit my song list as I knew it was proper protocol. But at the same time, after the service was done, and I would always go back and check in and be like, how was that? Was I off in any way? Like, did I sing anything out that I shouldn't have sung out? And most of the time they said, no, do it more. Or,
Yeah.
no, I had the affirmation that I needed when I was there. But once I left the Esther House and I married out of the Esther House, it was like I walked right back into what I had before the Esther House. And
Which
uh,
was what?
uh, just more the reprimand,
Yeah.
more of, I wasn't as connected with Francis and Edith any longer. It was kind of back to being under the worship pastor that I was under at the time. And I felt that, especially once I had my babies and I had the complications that I had, especially with the first one, that I wasn't able to maintain the expectations that were on me when I was single.
Yeah.
And so I started disappointing them more.
Disappointing Francis and Edith and just your mentors in general.
Yes,
Yeah.
specifically the worship pastor had told me that I had.
Yeah.
Um, but without getting into too much detail of that situation, I had still been very sick. My husband kind of touched on it in his podcast.
Yeah.
But I had severe preeclampsia with our daughter, and it took me about 7 months before I even recovered. Um,
Wow.
yeah, I was on a blood pressure cocktail, if you will. They call it, antihypertensives, and I was on 3 different ones, and it was just really bad. I had advanced HELP syndrome. I don't know if you know anything about that, but
No.
my family physician actually had said that had this been 30 years earlier, I would not be here today. So I was very toxic. Yeah, I was very toxic, and it took me a while to bounce back. That said, when you are a worship leader, it's very much promoted. Many people want to come back and lead worship right away. But under my circumstances, even though I completely intended to come back and lead worship within a short amount of time, I was not healthy enough to do that.
Yeah.
So when I was approached at 2 months postpartum to come back, I said that I would think about it. And by 3 months postpartum, I actually did go back and I gave it a try because they felt that my mental health needed refocusing and getting back into the groove of things. And so I gave it 3 months to try. And I just remember the burden becoming, weighty. And the baby wasn't sleeping through the night at this point. She's 6 months old, and I'm not off my blood pressure medication. And I just knew that staying up till midnight with the baby out, my husband
Yeah.
working shift work with one vehicle, it was just not working for me. So I did cover my bases and asked, hey, can I do this part-time? And again, this is volunteer. We got to realize I'm not getting paid for any of this, but the expectation is to treat it like it's your job.
Which can actually violate labor laws if you think about it.
Well, I don't know anything about that,
No.
but it's definitely an interesting point. But it was
A lot.
something, it was a lot. And so, without getting into too much detail about it, me and my husband both together, we made the decision that I was going to pull back. I was kind of given an ultimatum that it was all or nothing, considering I had already left and I couldn't go to part time. So I either had to do it or not do it. And so we decided that after, oh God, I don't even know how many years it was that I was there now, but I was part of that youth and young adults team for a long time. We're talking years.
Yeah.
And that was my first baby. Like, that to me was my first baby before my first baby.
Yeah.
And so it was a hard goodbye for me, but I decided that it was time to step down. And when I did, to say I disappointed them is an understatement.
What was told to you by the leaders when you decided to step down, which is a totally valid decision.
Girl, you're gonna need a second podcast with
Yeah. Just the main
this.
stuff.
Yeah, I'm like trying to skip ahead to when I
Yeah.
left, but
Yeah.
there's a lot. But yeah, no, it wasn't an easy go. It was not a smooth
No.
transition at all. There was he said, she said, there was, accusations towards me saying that I had, with pastor's blessing, I'm totally paraphrasing now because I don't
Yeah,
remember the
that's okay.
exact wordings, aside from the fact that I was called a disappointment. Not that I disappointed them, but that I was a disappointment. So outside of that, it was just questioned whether or not I actually had a proper formal release from my pastor to step down. I had met with him,
Yeah.
and he did give me his permission to make the decision with Grant that was best for our family at that time. And so I did. And when I emailed saying that I was stepping down after that, it was the expectation that after the New Year's service, where this big prophetic word came out, all aboard the train. And I was specifically asked by my mentor, "Are you all aboard?" And I'm like, "Yeah, I am." But I'm thinking to myself, that doesn't mean I'm going to stick around. Like,
Yeah.
And I could see the look in her face. And I believe it was the next service after that, if not a week later, we had a conversation, and she had completely expected me to repent for stepping down. Said that it was too late now. And I mean, I had no plans on picking it back up. And I kind of I felt that I was guilt tripped in that moment. And I
Yeah.
realized that the ministry had a need, but my health was very much overlooked. I felt like after all the years that I had authentically poured into the ministry and done my best to love people. Again, not being perfect. Trust me, I'm very well aware that no person's perfect, including myself. But I was very authentic in my pursuits for God and in my efforts to do the right thing and to be part of the ministry. And yeah, I just felt like I wasn't as valued. And so that was one of very many situations that our family had experienced. Of course, my husband saw the emails. He heard a lot of the dialogues. He saw me weeping in our room, and I would try my best to protect his heart and not tell him everything that I was going through, but he knew that there was something going on.
How hard was it to leave, to make that decision?
Okay, so my exit story, as I said, I had been there for 15 years. These people were my family. I had actually planned on Francis Armstrong giving me away for my wedding. I actually asked him to, and there was consideration there. But then we felt that it would be best if one of my brothers did at that time. And but he performed my wedding, and his daughter was my best friend. We had been best friends for years, and
Yeah.
um, I love them. Even to this day, I love them. It's just when you're in something, in an environment that is toxic like that, and you're vulnerable, and you learn to trust these people, and you learn to doubt yourself and not critically think for yourself, because if it's different from what they're teaching, then it's got to be the enemy. um, you know, I was in a position where I didn't see, yeah, okay, there would be hurts and wounds and you get offended and you work through it, but I didn't really see the toxicity up until I left. Um, I only saw it after I had left, once I was out of the environment, and looking back, you're like, oh my God, as if I thought that that was okay, as if that was my thought process, and leading up to my leaving, my husband, he had been studying and he had some questions, and he didn't feel free to ask any of his questions. Um,
To you?
no, well, I guess even to me, yeah,
Yeah.
because I would defend Francis and the theology preached within that environment, right? Like I believed it 1,000%, and I was sold out to it. Yeah, he had his own private journey, kind of deconstructing and asking questions, and eventually, through his own experiences, he can see patterns of behavior that are unhealthy. And so he started questioning a lot of things, and he decided to actually leave in March. He said that he was done. He didn't officially leave until the summer because he didn't ask for a release, but he had in his mindset and in his heart, he was done in March. And he told me that, and it broke me. And I remember relaying that information to my pastor. And um, I was told to not let my knees buckle, and that I was called to that house, no other house, to get back
Who
involved in worship.
who told you that?
This was Francis.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, he was like a father to me, right? And
Yeah.
and he kind of affirmed that in that moment, um, that was the house that I belonged to and no other house. And of course, that summer he went on a sabbatical, and things started to happen, and I started to see things, and my marriage at that point, for the first time ever, had a level of conflict to it and disconnect that had never been there before. So we had been married 6 years at that point, because we're coming up on 10 years now in January. And in 6 years, we had gone through a lot of different things, like unhealthy wife at pregnancy or unhealthy baby, but we were never at war with each other. And this was the first time that I was experiencing that in my home.
And
I
was
had,
that due to the Grant's exit?
yeah,
Okay.
yeah, exactly. Him
Yeah.
wanting to leave, and then he would want us to stay home on Sunday, but I wouldn't let us stay home on
Yeah.
Sunday. So I would go and he would follow me, and then he would embarrass me in the in the congregation when he would hear Francis preach, and he'd be like, "That's not what that's saying." And
Yeah.
I'd be like, "Shut up." Um, so yeah, it was awful. And then finally come September, there were a few things that happened that I won't get into, but my eyes were just opened, and I was like, you know what? I don't feel it's right for me to continue going to a church building when these people are my family and I'm hopeful. I remember thinking to myself, I was so naive, that I would still be able to take my kids over and visit them. Like I
Yeah.
was a girl. I used to sit on Francis's floor and
Yeah.
visit with them, and I was best friends with their daughter. And I just never thought about the fact that my relationships were going to fall into question.
Yep.
I just thought I had been there for so long and that I had invested in so much that still had a potential of staying the same, whether or
Yep.
not I was part of a building.
And that shouldn't change.
Technically, you're right.
Your
It
bonds
shouldn't.
with humans shouldn't be exclusive to a certain organization. This is something I noticed in the dance community,
Yeah,
even, and it's not healthy. I can't imagine what it would be like in a religious community, because you
right.
weren't walking away from God.
Not at that point, no.
Even if you had, it shouldn't matter. Those are
Yeah,
people. This is like an evolutionary thing. When you make a
right.
bond with someone and you spend time with them, it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
But you still felt that it mattered, or you hoped that it wouldn't.
I hoped that it would be different with me. And maybe that, as I said, it was naive to think that way, because for anybody else that I had seen leave, they're very much a pack mentality. And they, you hear the messages as people are leaving from the pulpit that people are deceived, people are gossipers, people are troublemakers. Like, again, paraphrasing, but essentially that's what is being said.
Yeah.
You look at the outsiders as outsiders, and it becomes a pack mentality on the inside. And I remember being that person. I was that person. And so now if I speak out, I'm not afraid of what they think, because I know when it comes to current members, it's going to take their own journey for their own eyes to be open. There's nothing that you or I, Tiana, can say to, we could talk blue in the face about the kind of dynamics that are within that church, but it's not going to open the eyes of the members. They have to see it for themselves.
Yep.
And when it comes to what we're doing right now, I want to make it very clear that it's all about raising awareness within the community.
Yeah.
I remember when you approached me back in the summer, and I went off Facebook for 3 weeks because I was like,
Yeah.
who is this girl? And now I'm so thankful for you and our friendship that has evolved. And
Me too.
yeah, and I just thank you for that. But it's been a journey. It's definitely been a journey. And I want what you want, which is to, raise awareness within the community of what's going on here, to reduce the stigma of religious trauma, and that this is
Yeah.
actually something that does happen. We need more resources for people who are dealing with the mental health ailments coming out of it. Like, I needed 12 rounds of CBT and anti-anxiety medication to get through my exit at third day. And
that's not normal. Can I just intercept for a second? There's a lot of talk, especially after what happened yesterday, going around in the secular community, which we're very much a part of still, claiming that this is normal for Christians. This is not normal church behavior. It's not normal.
Absolutely, it's not normal, and it shouldn't be normal, and neither should it be acceptable.
No.
It was a complete culture shock when I left, as it is for very many people who spend a year or 3 years or 5 years, or in my case 15 years, authentically trying to do their best to serve what they believe is God under a hierarchical structure strong, dominating leadership.
And you
And
can't blame the victims.
you cannot blame
Your
victims.
mind was not your own. You didn't
No.
go into it knowing what would happen.
You're
So
vulnerable.
you're not consenting to it because
Yeah.
they weren't forthcoming about what their, hierarchy was, what their
Yeah.
agenda was, what they were
Yeah.
going to be telling you.
And that's the thing. They definitely
Slowly.
they parade you. They fawn over you, so to speak, right?
Love bombing.
And yeah, and obviously you're vulnerable going in. Why does anybody try and search or start attending a church? They're searching for a meaning of life. They have questions, whether it be about eternity, maybe they grew up, but at some point when you're attending, especially a place like that, you ask yourself, okay, like, why am I here? What am I missing? What is this void? And you're vulnerable. And that is where I'm concerned personally, because I know that when I left, there was a complete culture shock. I did not know, I couldn't even connect with anybody in the secular world. Like, I did not know secular songs. I didn't know any movies that were current. Like, it was like I had been in such a bubble, and here I am.
Information control.
Oh
That's
my
what that
goodness.
was. Don't
Yeah.
watch this. Don't do that. That's information control.
Yeah. And here I am in university pursuing a second career, and it's
Killing it.
already a very stressful time.
Yeah.
Exactly. But I'm not only learning new material, I'm like in a completely different world from the world that I was before. And so it was a complete culture shock. And I remember the anxiety that came out.
What did you think was going to happen to you out in the world, separate from the Christian community? That's what I'm curious about.
Uh, like that's another heavy question. I was afraid to initially leave over the summer because I thought, where am I going to go? Um, I don't want to be under a curse. You kind of have it in your head, and it is preached quite often that if you leave third day without their blessing, then you must have backslidden. That's at least the prerogative that they allow other people to believe about people who have left. Um, I didn't want to be under a curse, and I was thinking about my children, and I very much had to adjust the vision I had always had for my life. My identity was wrapped up in third day. That's the best way I can describe it. I was supposed to be a Christian wife, a Christian mom, missionary, worship leader, but at the end of the day, being completely submitted to God and what His plan was for my life, serving Him. And I meant it. That was my complete heart and motive behind it. Yes, I felt closer to God than ever, because at that point, I had nobody. My relationships were severed almost immediately. Like, I was blocked off people's Facebooks, the social media. Like, people wouldn't talk to me if I saw them out in the community. It was absolutely heartbreaking. So I did have an element of peace knowing that I made the best decision for myself when I realized, okay, for me, it wasn't right as being a wife, keeping my husband at a church that he didn't want to be at anymore. And at the time, he was more than willing to visit other churches in the city and see if we could potentially go and find another home church. Now,
did that ever cross your mind before? Like, maybe we can find something else, because there's so many different churches. Then, like, did you ever feel like it would be okay to go somewhere else and have a family, or were you just so tightly knit with these people?
I was tightly knit. It was never an option. Absolutely never an option. As I said, there was multiple times, numerous times, like, my gosh, probably over 100 times where I could have left over a fence or something petty, right? Because human beings are human beings, and things are going to happen. But they were my people. They were my family. And so I fought hard, and I believed, Brad's going to come around and he's going to come back. But that summer was a really lonely summer, and I just felt like I was manipulating him to stay when he was willing to try it at another church. And it just didn't make sense that it didn't make sense to me, because I wanted what God wanted, that God would want me to allow a church to put a wedge between me and my husband.
Yeah.
It just didn't make sense. So I did make the call. At this point, I had already kind of I wouldn't even say that it was a spoken falling out, but even with my best friend at the time, like, our friendship had shifted, and I could feel that. And I felt very alone. And as I said, Francis and Edith, they were on a sabbatical. Um, didn't have a really good positive relationship with my mentor, because I had been off worship for a while, and it was just an ugly summer overall. And I was just like, okay, this is not connecting. And I knew I was going back to school, so there was no room for me to really be involved on their terms. That was another thing too. School was not really something that a lot of people agreed that I should do, because um, aside from one counselor, I really was not affirmed to go back and get post-secondary education, but I felt like that was something that I wanted to do for
That's
me.
probably the smartest decision you ever made. I mean, it's obviously it was very hard, and like, congrats that you got through that, because I would have. But yeah, and that's another thing that certain high demand groups will say. They don't like higher education. That's something that needs to happen.
Other perspectives, so that way you can, like, when I think about the approach of many modern day churches today, especially ones that function in similar ways to Third Day Worship Center and how they operate, it's very closed-minded, and they call it black and white. But I'm sorry, how can anybody relate to you, and how can you believe that you're going to be used or strategic in some big time national revival when you can't even properly manage the people that are in your own house?
Yeah.
At the end of the day, ultimately, it'd be wonderful if these people would evaluate their practice and take some honest perspective, reflect at what they're doing, and say, hey, we need to change this here for better outcomes. But when they're unwilling to do that, and unwilling to hear the voices of the people that are speaking out saying, hey, this is what you did to hurt me, and I love you despite that, here's your chance to make it right, and then they don't. And it's always shifting blame back onto the victim, or coming up with excuses,
Satan,
covering it up. Oh yeah, calling you Satan, Tiana. Like, oh my gosh, that's just like,
Satan is not your excuse. And
no.
the world is going to look at it. Sorry,
Yeah.
this is me being feisty. This is my one feisty moment. The world is looking at you right now, and it's making you look worse.
It does.
I mean, it's childish to
Can
call
I be
people
honest?
names, and it's ridiculous. The world is going to just bury you even more, because that is the worst thing. If that's the best you've got, well, go ahead. Like,
yeah.
okay.
The last straw of naivety in me was broken this summer. I grieved, and I think it's going to be the last time I grieved. I've been out of Third Day now for 4 years, and it's been a healing process. As I said, I needed 12 rounds of CBT, anti-anxiety medication. I've gotten through it, but this has been closure for me. And like speaking out and raising awareness and hearing other people. Like, when I say speaking out, I mean beyond just this podcast. I've been broadcasting other people's stories on my Instagram and Facebook.
You're doing a very good job of doing that.
Thank you. I support you guys, and I support this movement and raising awareness to bring attention to this issue in our community. I want to reduce that stigma that is associated with religious trauma and people who have social anxiety, and hopefully we can get more resources that are going to be locally accessible for people within our community that have these needs, because it's not something that is well researched. And ultimately, in the long run, I'd love to see a legislation take place that helps protect the community from high demand groups like these. If I cannot practice in my realm without some regulatory body overseeing the work that I do, and if my husband cannot practice without, and he does counseling, some sort of regulatory body, how is it that there are people under the Charter of Rights and Religious Freedoms, if you will, how can they deal with these delicate psyches of vulnerable people and have no board of accountability? It makes no sense. And there's harm, there's exploitation, there has been suicide, there has been attempts at suicide, and someone has to pay attention. Somebody's got to take a look at what's going on and do it.
You can't tell people
in these groups.
You can't tell people to go off their medication.
No,
you are not. You cannot take drug addicts in and say you're going to help them using the Lord. I'm sorry. No, you're not qualified. If a teacher at an elementary school with just a degree in teaching can't do it,
Yeah.
It's not acceptable for because religious freedom is getting sticky now.
It depends on the background of each individual person who's conducting
Yeah.
that kind of instruction and their sphere of influence, right? But in this case, you're right. There's not a whole lot of academic grounds behind these decisions. And I for one, when I had my firstborn and I was recovering from preeclampsia, it was recommended because of my postpartum anxiety, which did recover. So I'll give them that.
Good.
But it was recommended that I go on anti-anxiety medication at that point because I had white coat syndrome because my blood pressure was so high. Having her every time that I would go in for a physical assessment, white coat syndrome. Let me explain that because I saw the look on your face there.
What that is at all.
My heart would palpate. Like I'd be completely fine in the moment that I would walk into a doctor's office for a physical examination, get my blood pressure taken. All of a sudden my heart would start racing, my blood pressure would go up.
Oh, okay.
So they couldn't really determine whether or not it was anxiety that was influencing my blood pressure because of the trauma that I had experienced during my delivery with my daughter, or if it was because my blood pressure actually was not,
Okay.
was not settling on its own with the medications that I was on. So they wanted me to go on anti-anxiety medication. So at least the anxiety would be stabilized and then they could get a good picture as to whether or not they could wean me off my medication.
Mhm.
And I was going to start it. And I had one leader tell me, yes, a diabetic needs medication. So you take your medication. But the moment that Francis came into the room and told me not to take the medication, all of a sudden the instruction at the end of the meeting was, no, we're not going to take our medication. And so I didn't
Don't
take
need any more examples than that to make your point.
So I can vouch for the people who have come forward already and said, oh yeah, no, they did that. Nobody's lying. Nobody wants to lie about this ministry. We loved you and love you still.
Yeah.
And all we want is for people to take responsibility and be accountable for their actions and to really reflect on your practice and say, hey, is there something that we can change here? Because clearly something's wrong. If you want to grow a successful ministry, then can I even go here? You know, like people are trying to speak up and it's not being received, and that's okay. They don't need to receive it. That is fine. That's not my priority. But my priority right now is obviously to keep the community safe. And I've already listed what I hope comes from us sharing our stories in the long run.
And other people who aren't even, because you said you've been getting messages from people who experienced trauma in a religious setting that didn't even go to third day.
Oh yeah.
This is a major thing.
Absolutely. Religious trauma is something that is beyond third day. Third day is just a local example that we're dealing with right now because it's an active issue within our community. So of course it's something to talk about. However, it expands way beyond that. It is a North American issue. It's even beyond that, you know?
Yeah.
And so, you know, if people are unfamiliar with religious trauma, I second what my husband said. If nobody's heard that podcast, or just as a reminder, Dr. Marlene Winnell is a good place to start. She's the author of Leaving the Fold. Yes. And that is where I started to really learn about religious trauma and the effects that it can have even on your emotional development, your psychological development, your sexual development, just from purity culture to, you know, everything else in between that we talked about, the control that is in this place. Like, doing what I do, I have to be able to rely on me being able to make decisions myself, thinking critically, using education. I have to be able to have that confidence, right? But 4 years ago, I was not that person. I was always having to double check what I did with, we'll say 5 years ago, because 4 years ago I left. But 5 years ago and beyond that, you're constantly under submission to this authority that would tell you were wrong if you disagreed with them. And they would tell you, you know, test me out. Don't believe me. Go and test it out for yourself. But if you actually did that and came back with a different answer, then you're
demon.
at risk of, yes, you just found out. Yes, demon. Right? So, yeah. And of course, we know you're not. So
Spirit of doubt. That's the other one. When you have doubts, it's not a bad thing.
Yeah.
It's okay.
No, it is. You have a question. It's okay to ask questions. And I love that. That is something that another pastor in the city had told me. It is absolutely okay to ask questions. And there's nothing that you can say to scare us away or scare God away, you know? And that's a healthier perspective to have.
Yeah.
Um,
I go at it. I mean, not in anger or anything, but like this summer, I started playing with the idea of getting baptized. So I meet with one of the worship leaders and I was like, okay, so, and we get into like these deep discussions and I think too much and I question too much.
yeah.
Obviously why it's chronically questioning. And
Yeah.
she'd just sit there and I was never offensive or anything. We talk about certain issues like abortion or, you know, gay rights. And they're always great at my church, but
Yeah.
she'd sit there finally and she'd just go, I don't know. And I'd be like, well, what about the second coming? Like, is it going to be climate change that's going to kill us? Or is Jesus going to come in? Like, what's happening? And she's just, I don't know. And I can't deal with that. I need to know now.
Yeah.
But they're so good with it though. They're just like, I don't know. It's going to be fine. It's like, okay, that's normal. And it's okay to ask.
Yeah, exactly. And I do want to say, you know, there has been good that's come out from there. You know, I
Absolutely
can't sit there and say all the bad things without highlighting some of the good. I did get married and have two beautiful children. I found my family there. I had some great missionary experiences where I met some wonderful people who do not operate that way. But those good experiences and the good that has been done to people in the community, even at Christmas time, you know, like there's been outreaches that we've done that I was part of where we go to a school within the community and hand out gifts, you know, that these are good things. The good that they have done does not give them permission to cause the harm that they can do and that they have done. It doesn't exempt them from the responsibility that they have to make the wrongs that they have done right. Mm-hmm. And yes, I've received some fear-based apologies, even as of recently. And of course, I won't get into my speculations as to why they've come. That's irrelevant. But at the end of the day, I am still blocked on social media.
They're blocking people in the community now too, that are just asking about COVID.
Right. And so, you know, I'm just saying that a lot of actions don't line up with their words. And they aren't speaking to, and that's their right. They don't have to.
Yeah.
But the fact that they're unwilling to speak with news anchors or just even approach anybody regarding some of the allegations that have been said, there's no attempt for a resolution to be made. And that to me is more telling than receiving a random private message.
And why you won't let people, why you won't let people in the community come to your church to see for themselves. Yeah. Exactly. Why you're blocking people's messages. Why you won't let certain people comment on the page now when they have valid concerns.
No, and let's be honest, that's definitely part of their RSVP system. Their RSVP system is not completely existent solely for COVID purposes. They're keeping an eye on who is coming in and who is coming out with everything else that is going on. And you have experienced that for yourself, having been somebody who tried to RSVP to their services, and then you have evidence, you have that email that
are coming after people online. Why are there random people coming after me in Reddit private messages? Why are people going after your husband online?
But that is typical though. Again, they're not going to do that where their names are associated with it. They're going to be great at doing it when they can hide behind a Reddit anonymous post. And that's where, for me, say what you want. You know, like I have no personal issue. I've had to move on. It's broken my heart to leave that place.
Yeah.
You know, nobody will know the nights that I woke up. Like I definitely didn't have an issue falling asleep because I'd be so exhausted from crying when I first left, probably within the first 2 years. But nobody knows about the nights where I would wake up and be stuck awake with heart palpitations, thinking to myself, just hold your husband, do not get out of bed, because I was afraid of what I was going to do. it was such a dark place. And initially I knew that I felt, like I had done the right decision. But there was a point where I did entertain, like once Grant decided that he was going to be agnostic and we weren't going to go to a church after, this was probably about 9 months after we had left. I had that self-doubt moment again. And I'm like, I have these two kids, they're young kids. And oh my gosh, I never thought about raising my children outside of church. And was I wrong? Like, what should I have done? And what's the point in going to another church now with just me and the kids when I could have just stayed with my church family with the two kids there? And so I did,
Yeah.
entertain the idea of going back. And so I had reached out and I had asked for a meeting with one of the leaders. I'm not going to say who, just to respect them, because it ended up being a very positive experience with them personally. But in order to get that meeting, I needed to repent to two members of the congregation first and to Francis himself. And so I did. I repented to the two members of the church, and both members did say, well, if so-and-so said that I was distraught about something that you had posted online, it must be true, but I don't remember having an issue, or I think I remember something like that, but thank you for the apology. I wasn't expecting that. So whatever, I did. I apologized to them and I apologized to Francis and I got my meeting. In order for me to go back, there were some stipulations that were in place. Number one, my husband had to be 100% on board with me going back. And I'm like, well, talk no further, because that's not going to happen. He's not going to control me. He's not going to say, no, you can't be part of this. But we're never going to have his 100% support in me coming back to this place, because he's agnostic and he believes you guys are toxic. But aside from that, step number two, I would have had to have gone through various counseling sessions with this individual. And then from there, I'd have to assume meetings with the deacon once they thought I was ready. Deacons, yeah, the deacons of the church. They're like what they would call, I guess, I don't know how to compare it, like a board, if you will, but they don't run the church.
Okay.
They're just people that are part of the ministry that
Okay.
have leadership roles, I guess, if you will. And then from there, once they were, felt that I was ready, then I would be able to meet with Francis himself, the Edith herself, and then from there, once they felt I was ready, that they would reinstate me by me repenting in front of the church.
In front of the church,
yeah,
you'd have to repent.
I'd have to repent in front of the church, and they would reinstate me at that point.
For
and
what?
I'm like,
For
that
leaving?
is for leaving, for anything that I might have said. Can't remember everything now, but yeah, for anything that I might have said to people while I had been away and why I was away, and
so telling people the truth why you needed a break,
or why I had left. Yeah, they would. Here's the thing with them too, is that they assume that it's all lies. That's kind of the pattern, and I remember believing it when I was there, when they would say it about other people who had left. And again, as I said, it's a pack mentality. Once you're inside, you have that trust with them, but once it's about you, you're like, oh crap, okay. It hasn't always been, that's just what they resort to, oh, that person's just a troublemaker, or that person's a gossip, or that person's a Jezebel. That's a big one. I don't think, as far as I know, they've never said that about me, but I've heard that said about other people that had left.
You're married, so I don't think Jezebel would make much sense.
But they've said other things, definitely said other things about me. And it definitely, resulted in people blocking me off of Facebook, or deleting me off of Facebook, or just, not reaching out and not talking to me.
Meanwhile, you're up in the middle of the night with heart palpitations.
Yeah.
Afraid and unable to sleep.
I was totally suicidal. I'm going to just put it right out there. Yeah. But I was open about it, and I told my family doctor, and I told the social worker that I went through for my CBT, and he got me the help that I needed. And so, yeah, I was able to unlearn certain things. I learned great coping strategies, and I was able to overcome it. But unfortunately, there are those who don't. And that's my concern today. That is why I'm speaking out, because I had access to help, but not everybody does. And not everybody knows this side of my story. They're just told what they were told, if anybody knows it. but they'll never know how dark it actually got until, I guess, right now. So, you
Good
know,
for you for speaking out.
yeah,
Do you
well, it's
want
important.
do you want to talk about religious trauma survivors of Canada before you go? That was kind of a partnership
Yep.
between the both of us.
Yep. Something we're doing together. Privileged to work with you on it.
You too, because you know a lot about this stuff.
Oh my
A
gosh.
lot.
I'll just
Yeah.
say this. That was one thing that in my learning through university that really helped me overcome was learning about power imbalances. We Anybody that I went to school with will be able to remember some of the courses and books we had to read and the papers we had to write. And we definitely talked a lot about oppression, the cycle of oppression, and peace powers is what we called it. And in that, I was able to actually remember a whole lot for my exams because I was able to apply it to what I had just walked out of. And I'm like, oh my goodness, that is exactly the best way to put it when it comes to hierarchical structures that are in places like their day and the type of leadership that are there. There's a power imbalance. And that brings me to the Charter of Rights.
Yeah.
When it comes to religious trauma, I realize that, churches claim that they have religious freedom and they try to keep government out of the church. But this is where I would love to summon somebody somewhere, somehow, to bring about a legislation that helps protect the public, because the Charter of Rights is actually meant for everyone. It's not something that's just existent for the church. Once you have, I firmly believe that once you have somebody's freedom imposing on the freedom of somebody else, that's where you have a power imbalance. That is where you get into religious trauma. And especially when you're dealing with the people who won't self reflect and be responsible
Yes.
and take accountability for their actions. So, you know, do I want bad things to come to any of these high demand groups? No,
Oh,
I do not. Absolutely not. But do I want the public to be protected? Do I want more people to experience the harm and the exploitation that I myself and other people have experienced? Absolutely not. And if people are unwilling to change their behavior, then something else needs to come about to protect those that are vulnerable.
well said.
So,
And well, that's also where we came together for religious trauma survivors, because
mhm.
you experienced when you left, you didn't know what happened. You didn't know what was going on. You had nowhere to go. There's lots of resources for,
What do you mean? Can you?
like, when you were experiencing those heart palpitations, it took reading Dr. Winnell's book,
Yeah.
essentially, and that course of power imbalances that you
Mm-hmm.
learned
Mm-hmm.
to understand what happened.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the other thing. We need to educate the non-religious world to
Absolutely.
understand that just because you don't believe in something doesn't mean it's not causing extreme harm to other people.
It's not just leaving a church,
No.
and that's the difference. Maybe for somebody who just tried a church and wasn't really sold out on it, but for people who literally made it their life, their whole identity
Yep.
was set on whatever belief system was taught there. And that was my situation. So you take that away. I went from a world of theology to a world of science. I went from a world of a certain type of friends to no friends, my family, but I had to make all these new friends, and which is a blessing now, but I literally had no support system. And I was in university in a very high intense program, which I'm thankful for. But I say all that to say that it was definitely not just, oh, she left the church. And I know many people can actually relate with that, to people who are very authentic and trying their best to ask God to deliver them of whatever it is they're being reprimanded for. We've heard multiple stories so far, Tiana, that you have so beautifully hosted, from Ben to
Thank you.
Ashley to Nicole. Yeah,
Yeah.
we've heard so many beautiful but heart-wrenching stories of people who have wounds. And it's the bottom line is they have wounds. Nobody gets to argue with that. Those are their feelings. Those are their experiences. They could be called liars. The church can call them liars all they want. It's not. They don't have that right, is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah.
Um, they wounded them. So just be responsible and say, I'm sorry, and try and do better moving forward.
Yeah.
But that hasn't happened. I remember one time, if I could just conclude with this, my husband and I, we moved out to Amersfoort. And when I talk about subordination, this is a classic example. We were having a little bit of a hard time because of our daughter, my health issues, that sort of thing, and with one vehicle and shift work. And I don't recall if Grant actually talked about this in his podcast, but I remember we were actually told, or I was told, well, who said you could move out to Amersfoort? And I was like, pardon me? And they're like, did you ever ask me about how I felt about you moving out to Amersfoort? And I was like, I didn't think I had to. But, and that's all I'll say about that conversation. But I just remember being taken aback, like, oh my gosh, like I genuinely did not even realize that something as simple as moving out to Amersfoort, which is not that far from here. I don't live in Amersfoort now. Let's just put that out there so people don't start knocking on doors. No, I'm just kidding. Go find Jenn and take her down. But you know, like it was just little things like that where you had to submit and ask. Like my wedding day, even before I even met my husband, like I talked about purity culture. I didn't date for 9.5 years. I did not. Like I talked to guys here and there if they messaged me online or whatever. And when I say guys, there's two I can think of. But like, I know it was really funny because youth group, you would literally have like girls on one side of youth group and then guys on the other side. And it would be very rare if we ever mingled. It's kind of funny to look back on now. But yeah, it was just like, you know, literally from my husband, which I did love at the time, meeting with the pastor to get his blessing to court me. And then from there, he asked his permission to ask me to marry him, which was 2 months later. And then from there, literally down to the season that we were getting married in, we ran by our pastor. The only thing that we got to choose was the actual wedding date. And that to us, it's not that they actually sat there and said, okay, guys, you have to do this completely to a T, just like this. They didn't say that, but it was definitely promoted that yes.
Coerced?
Pardon?
Coerced?
No,
in a way?
No, just to do it the right way. And
okay.
do it the right way was to submit it always step by step to the pastor. And that's what was known, including not kissing until you're up at the altar on the day of. That was definitely something that was highly regarded. But is that actually in the Bible? Is it actually in the Bible that says, thou shalt not kiss until you say, I do?
I don't think so.
I don't think so either. And I've read it 4 times from cover to cover.
Just like it says, thou shalt not take vaccines.
Oh my gosh, don't even get me started on that.
Thou shalt not trust Bill Gates.
Can we just say this? There's no chip coming from the COVID vaccine.
No chip, please.
We're just going to put that out there.
I don't even know if you could fit that in a vaccine. I got my flu shot a few weeks ago.
Yeah, no, you can't. I mean, I'm sure.
Technology's not that advanced yet. Like,
dude. Yeah.
That's all we're going to say.
That's all we're going to say about that. No, there is no plan as far as I am aware. I am not all-knowing, but I can very much tell you that there's definitely no plan to be chipping people through the COVID vaccine. So, God.
Topic. Like, I don't want to sound sensitive, but like.
No, it's good that we can clarify these things to people who are willing to listen.
It's, again, your mind's not your own. If you're listening to this and you're going through something similar, your mind's not your own right now. And me telling you that's probably going to trigger you. And I'm really sorry. But this is the only thing we can do before there's legislation.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Exactly. Talk about it, raise awareness. We know that when it comes to people who are former members, talking is healing. That is definitely something that Dr. Marlene Winnell talks about. She encourages, therapists encourage it. When I was doing CBT, you need to talk about your experiences and ask those questions, because honestly, without that, you're just going to stay in this dark place. And there is light at the end of the tunnel. I'm still working towards it. I'm not there yet, but I've definitely come a long freaking way.
You have.
Yeah.
You were another one who didn't want to talk to me at all when I first reached out. You and Melanie were both like, nope.
Yeah. Yeah. I went off freaking Facebook because of you, girl.
And I was like, I'm really sorry. But like,
But
I've been told that you know what's happening and I need to know answers immediately, like I've stated.
yeah, the best part was when you're like, oh, okay, well, I was hoping then that you could tell me about this other Jen. And then you said my maiden name. And I was like, that other Jen would be me as well before I was married.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was like, why are people telling you to talk to me? So, yeah. But anyway, thank you for reaching out. Thank you for having me. Um, if anybody has any questions, I'm definitely a safe place.
Yes,
Feel
very
free to bring
safe.
your questions to me. I'm non-judgmental, whether you're currently a member or not a member of this particular church. I definitely have a heart for you and what you're going through. I am a busy girl. I work shift work and I'm a mom and wife, but I will get back to your requests or your questions as soon as I can.
And if anything else is needed, you can reach out to me. I mean, I sound very callous on this podcast, I think just because
You're tired.
I'm tired and I'm hungry. And yesterday was a whirlwind of shit show, gong show ness, if that's a word. But I can't empathize a lot. I didn't experience it myself, but I've been doing lots of research on high demand groups, these kinds of organizations. Charismatic, evangelical, dominionist theology in general is just toxic.
Mhm.
And I do know a lot about it. I'm not an expert, but I can point you to some experts. And check out our social media, Religious Trauma Survivors of Canada. Over the holidays, we're hoping to get it actually registered as a registered charity so that, people leaving groups like this or people who have left years before and haven't healed at all can access the mental health care that they need. Because this is the thing that drives me insane about the fact that there's no legislation, is the fact that the government's not protecting you from organizations like this. And then when you leave, if you can leave with all the wounds you have, they're not going to subsidize your mental health care.
Mhm. That's right.
And that's not fair. It's like you either protect them or you subsidize it.
Yeah.
So that's what hopefully we're working towards, trying to get people covered when they leave these things, because it's needed, clearly.
Yeah.
And if you're on medication already for mental health and your pastor or your imam or your Buddha is telling you to go off it for religious reasons, please don't. Like, that's all I can say. Please don't. Doctors are not evil. Mental health is a real thing. It needs
It needs
medication sometimes,
it
and
needs to
talk
take the amount of
therapy.
care that your body would need if it's sick.
Your brain's an organ.
Yeah.
So with that, thanks again.